A two-time Pro Bowler just quietly told his former teammates his NFL career is over, and one of the most explosive receivers of the last 5 years is still sitting on the open market 2 weeks before training camp with nobody willing to sign him. Dre here from Dre Talk Sports, and both of these storylines are swirling around the Cincinnati Bengals right now, whether this front office wants them to or not. One is a name from this team's past, possibly closing the book on his career for good. The other is a name from outside this organization that keeps getting connected to Cincinnati in national rumor mills, and I want to break down whether either of these storylines actually deserves the attention it's getting, because I think the honest answer is more complicated than either the hype or the nostalgia is letting on. Let's start with the harder one, because it deserves to be handled with some real respect before we get into anything roster-related. Joe Mixon's playing career appears to be over. Not officially, not on paper, no retirement papers have been filed as of right now, but according to reporting out of Houston, Mixon has told former Bengals teammates directly that he is done playing football. And when you trace the full arc of how we got here, it's honestly one of the more brutal, unlucky stories in recent NFL memory. Go back to 2024, Mixon gets traded from Cincinnati to Houston, and in year one with the Texans, he balls out. 1,016 yards on the ground, 11 touchdowns, over 300 yards through the air, 12 total scores, a Pro Bowl selection. He looked like he'd found a genuine second act to his career in a new building. Then comes an off-season foot injury that, by every account, was almost impossibly strange. Texans general manager Nick Caserio called it a freak thing in his own words, saying nobody had real clarity on what was going on with Mixon's foot from the start of that year all the way to the end of the season. Reports have since suggested the injury may have stemmed from something as mundane as dropping a weight on his foot during an off-season workout, followed by treatment outside the team's own medical structure that, according to reporting, only made things worse instead of better. Whatever the exact chain of events, the result was brutal. Mixon missed the entire 2025 season, was released by Houston back in March of this year, went through additional surgery to try to fix a foot that reportedly had ongoing blood flow issues, and now, according to a source close to him, there's some hope, but probably it's over. I want to sit with that for a second before we move on, because I think it's worth actually appreciating what Joe Mixon's career meant to this organization instead of just rushing past it to get to the roster-building conversation. This is a guy who came into Cincinnati back in 2017 in the second round, carrying real baggage from a college incident that a lot of teams simply weren't willing to look past. And whatever you think about that decision at the time, Mixon spent 7 seasons in this building, including some of the genuinely darkest years this franchise has ever had, long before Joe Burrow ever set foot in Cincinnati. He was here through the 1-win seasons, he was here through the total roster rebuilds. And then he got to be part of one of the most magical stretches in franchise history, the Super Bowl run in 2021, where he was a real, physical, load-bearing piece of an offense that had to grind out ugly, low-scoring playoff wins in bad weather against physical AFC North-style opponents. If his career is truly over, he leaves the game with over 7,000 rushing yards and 60 touchdowns since entering the league, a Super Bowl appearance, and a body of work that, love him or not, matters to how this era of Bengals football gets remembered. That's a real career, and I think it deserves a real moment of respect before we pivot into talking about depth charts and open roster spots. Now, here's where I have to be the honest voice in the room, because I know exactly what some of you were thinking reading recent headlines connecting Mixon back to Cincinnati as a potential reunion signing. If this reporting is accurate, and I want to stress, Mixon himself has not made anything official, then that entire storyline is dead on arrival. You cannot build a roster plan around a player who has privately told his own former teammates that he's done. That's not a depth move waiting to happen. That's a closed chapter. If you've seen chatter online about Cincinnati potentially bringing him back for one more run, I'd take that with a massive grain of salt right now, because the far more credible reporting says the opposite is true. It's a sad way for a genuinely productive, well-liked career to potentially end, on the shelf, away from the game, dealing with an injury that even his own general manager in Houston struggled to fully explain. But it is what it is, and this fan base should probably start preparing itself for the idea that we've already seen the last of Joe Mixon in pads. Let's dig a little deeper into just how strange and drawn out this whole saga actually was, because I don't think the full timeline gets appreciated enough when it's reduced to a single headline. This didn't happen suddenly. Mixon actually missed OTAs and minicamp back in the spring of 2025 with what was initially believed to be an ankle issue. Then, in late July of that year, right as training camp was opening, the Texans placed him on the non-football injury list, which immediately ruled him out for at least the first 4 games of the season. Caserio said at the time that Mixon would need at least another month beyond that before any real decision could be made on his availability. And then that month came and went, and another one after that, and by late November, Houston had effectively closed the door on any chance of him suiting up at all in 2025. Along the way, there was even a moment back in the fall where a report suggested Mixon might not play at all that season, and Mixon himself publicly pushed back on it on social media, seemingly frustrated that reporters appeared to know more about his own body than he did. His agent at the time gave a cryptic, almost bitter response about the gap between what was being reported and what Mixon himself was actually saying. That back and forth, in hindsight, tells you just how murky and frustrating this entire situation was even for the people closest to it. Nobody, including Mixon himself in real time, seemed to have a firm grip on what was actually happening with his body or when, if ever, he'd be able to return. And I think that texture matters, because it changes how you should read the recent reporting. This isn't a case of a player quietly fading away after a down year, the way careers sometimes naturally wind to a close. This is a case of a genuinely productive, still effective veteran back getting derailed by something bizarre and medically confusing enough that even his own team's general manager, a guy whose entire job is understanding player health and value, described it as a situation where nobody had real clarity from start to finish. There were even fringe rumors floating around about how the initial injury actually happened, including one particularly strange claim that Mixon had shot himself in the foot, which has been directly and firmly denied. The more grounded reporting suggests something far more mundane and almost tragically ordinary. A weight dropped on his foot during a routine off-season workout, followed by treatment outside the team's own medical structure that, rather than fixing things, seems to have made the underlying issue worse over time, eventually developing into a blood flow problem serious enough to require additional surgery just this year. That's about as unglamorous and unlucky an ending to a career as you can script, and it's worth sitting with that unfairness for a second instead of just filing this away as a normal aging curve retirement. I also want to push back gently on any version of this conversation that tries to spin this into a roster-building opportunity for Cincinnati, because I've genuinely seen some corners of the fan base still holding out hope for exactly that. I understand the emotional pull, a former franchise back, a guy who was here for the darkest years and the best years both, riding off into the sunset back where it all started, taking a handoff in stripes one more time. It's a great story on paper. But a great story on paper doesn't override what the actual reporting says, and right now the actual reporting says this is a player who has privately, directly told the people closest to him from his old locker room that he's finished. That's about as clear a signal as you're going to get without an official press release. Building any kind of roster plan, hypothetical or otherwise, around a reunion with Joe Mixon right now would mean ignoring the most credible information we actually have. I'd rather be straight with you about that than sell you a nostalgic storyline that the facts don't currently support. Let's take a moment to actually appreciate the football, though, because I think it's worth remembering what made Mixon genuinely good, not just serviceable, during his time in Cincinnati. He fit the AFC North's identity about as well as any skill player this franchise has had in the modern era, a division built on physicality, on grinding out yards in bad weather against defenses that want to hit you in the mouth, and Mixon never once shied away from that. Go back and watch that AFC Championship drive against Kansas City in the 2021 season, the one that set up the game-winning field goal and sent this team to the Super Bowl. That was Mixon, drive after drive, running between the tackles, wearing down a defense, doing exactly the unglamorous physical work that gets overshadowed by the flashier throw a few plays later, but is every bit as responsible for the outcome. Or go back to that low-scoring divisional round grind against Tennessee that same postseason. Another game where Mixon's toughness between the tackles mattered as much as anything else on the stat sheet. And obviously there's the moment everybody remembers, even if they've forgotten the final score that night, Mixon throwing a touchdown pass to T. Higgins in the Super Bowl itself. A trick play that worked to perfection and gave this franchise one of its most electric moments in team history, regardless of how that particular game ultimately ended. That's a real, tangible legacy, and if this is genuinely the end, it's a legacy this fan base should remember fondly rather than just filing away as a footnote in a roster needs conversation. All right, let's shift gears completely, because there's a second name being connected to Cincinnati right now that's generating a lot more active buzz: Deebo Samuel. And I've seen this take floating around in a few corners of the internet, this idea that the Bengals should go out and add Samuel to pair with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, giving this offense an embarrassment of riches at the receiver position. I want to walk through this seriously, because on the surface it's an exciting name to throw around. But I think when you actually dig into the numbers and the fit, the case falls apart fast. And I want to explain exactly why. Let's start with who Deebo Samuel actually is at this stage of his career, because I think a lot of the hype attached to his name is still living in 2021. That was genuinely one of the best receiver seasons anybody put together that year. 77 catches, over 1,400 yards, 6 touchdowns, first-team All-Pro honors. A guy Kyle Shanahan deployed as a hybrid receiver running back who was legitimately one of the most explosive weapons in the entire league. But here's the uncomfortable truth about that 2021 season. It remains the only truly elite year of Samuel's career. Since then, the tape has told a pretty consistent story of decline. San Francisco eventually moved off his money entirely, trading him to Washington last year. And even in a Commanders offense that leaned on him heavily due to injuries elsewhere in that receiver room, Samuel finished 2025 with 72 catches for just 727 yards, a career-low 10.1 yards per catch. That number matters more than people give it credit for. Deebo Samuel's entire value proposition throughout his career has been explosiveness after the catch. A guy who turns short completions into chunk plays through pure physical violence. When that number craters to a career low, that's not noise. That's a real signal about where his physical gifts are trending as he enters his age 30 season. And look at the market reaction to him right now, because the market doesn't lie the way hype takes sometimes do. Samuel's contract in Washington actually voided back in the spring, which made him an unrestricted free agent all the way back in March. That means he has had, as of this recording, months and months to find a new home, and as of right now, deep into July with training camps opening, he remains unsigned. Projections earlier this offseason had him potentially landing something in the range of a 2-year, $31 million deal. That number has not materialized into an actual contract from anybody. The going rate teams seem willing to actually offer him has reportedly cooled to something closer to a 1-year prove-it deal in the $8 to $12 million range, and even that hasn't produced a signature yet. When a genuinely talented, well-known name with real name recognition around the league sits unsigned for this long, it's rarely bad luck. It's usually the league quietly agreeing on something that outside fans haven't fully caught up to yet, that the risk-reward here isn't as clean as the name value suggests. So let's actually talk about fit, because even setting the decline aside for a second, I don't think this makes sense for Cincinnati specifically, and here's my honest, unfiltered opinion on why. This receiver room is already, by a wide margin, the best position group on this entire roster. You've got Jamar Chase, the best receiver in football, entering his physical prime at 26 years old. You've got T. Higgins, a legitimate number 1 receiver on probably 25 other teams in this league, playing the role of a complimentary number 2 here. You've got a running back in Chase Brown, who caught a franchise record number of passes out of the backfield last year, and a tight end room that's versatile enough that some of these guys function like extra receivers in their own right. Football has one ball. One guy catches it on any given play. Adding a 30-year-old receiver in decline, no matter how recognizable the name, to a room that's already this deep and this talented, doesn't address a real need. It just adds a name to a position group that was never the problem in the first place. And I think there's a deeper roster construction principle worth naming here, because I don't think it gets said clearly enough by people chasing the exciting hypothetical instead of the practical reality. When your team's biggest remaining question marks are on defense, depth at linebacker, depth at cornerback behind your two starters, offensive line depth beyond the starting five, spending real cap dollars on a name-value receiver who doesn't address any of those actual needs is exactly the kind of move that looks exciting in a headline and does almost nothing to actually raise your championship odds. Cincinnati just spent this entire offseason being disciplined and surgical about roster building, trading a first-round pick specifically for Dexter Lawrence because the defensive line desperately needed it, adding Jonathan Allen because the interior needed even more juice, rebuilding the safety room with Kyle Duggar and Brian Cook because that specific unit had real documented weaknesses. Every single one of those additions addressed a genuine hole. Deebo Samuel doesn't address a hole. He addresses a want, and I think good front offices know the difference between the two, especially this late in an offseason when the smart, disciplined thing to do is protect your cap flexibility for actual needs rather than chase a name for the sake of a name. There's also a financial piece of this that I think gets glossed over in the excitement. This front office is already navigating a genuinely stacked group of contract situations this summer, DJ Turner reportedly closing in on an extension, Dax Hill and Chase Brown both waiting their turn for new deals, Miles Murphy somewhere in that same mix. Every single dollar this organization commits to an outside free agent this summer is a dollar that isn't going toward locking up your own ascending homegrown talent before their price tags climb even higher. That's not me being cheap on Cincinnati's behalf. That's just sound asset management. You don't sign a name-value depth piece at a position of strength while your actual own players, guys who are already proven fits in this locker room and this scheme, are sitting there waiting for extensions that matter far more to this roster's long-term outlook. Now, I do want to steelman the other side of this for a second, because I think it's fair to at least understand where the appeal comes from before dismissing it entirely. Deebo Samuel, even in decline, remains a legitimately dangerous weapon after the catch. 63% of his receiving yardage last year came after the catch, which tells you the explosiveness hasn't completely disappeared, it's just less consistent than it used to be. And there's a version of this argument that says, hey, if you could get him on a true bargain, a one-year deal in the range of what's actually materializing on the open market, you're not really risking much, and if Jamar Chase or T. Higgins goes down with an injury during the season, you've got a proven veteran name ready to step into a real role instead of relying entirely on unproven depth. I don't think that argument is crazy, but I do think it's a nice-to-have argument, not a need-to-have argument, and this late in an offseason, with real defensive and depth needs still sitting on the table elsewhere on this roster, I'd rather see this front office spend its remaining bandwidth and cap flexibility on addressing an actual hole than on insurance for a position that's already the strongest unit on the entire team. Let's also talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough in these hypothetical free agent pairings, locker room and scheme continuity. This receiver room has real continuity heading into 2026. Guys who've played together, developed chemistry with Joe Burrow, built real trust in this specific system over multiple years now. Dropping a new name into that room this late, no matter how talented, means burning practice reps and install time on somebody who's realistically going to be your fourth or fifth option in the passing game rather than somebody genuinely pushing your ceiling higher. Compare that to the value of simply letting your existing young receiver behind Chase and Higgins, somebody who's already had a full offseason in this system, continue developing with real reps instead of ceding some of those reps to a 30-year-old name value addition, learning a brand new offense from scratch in the middle of training camp. That continuity argument matters more than people give it credit for, especially for a team that spent this entire offseason being praised specifically for how drama-free and continuity-focused its roster building has been. Let's actually trace his decline year by year, because I think it tells a more complete story than just pointing at last year's yards per catch number in isolation. Back in 2022, Samuel missed 4 games with knee and ankle issues, and while the 49ers kept feeding him touches in the run game, his big play juice in the passing game noticeably dipped, barely over 11 yards per catch, and only a single reception all season that went for 40-plus yards. That's a real drop-off from the guy who was breaking off chunk plays seemingly every other week in 2021. Then, 2023 brought more of the same inconsistency. A couple of complete no-catch performances mixed in with a hot 4-game scoring stretch that padded the overall numbers without erasing the volatility underneath them. By 2024, the tape had turned genuinely concerning. Samuel finished 44th among all receivers league-wide, missing time with a calf issue, a wrist issue, an illness, and finally ending his season early with a rib injury. San Francisco, a team that had built its entire offensive identity around maximizing exactly what Samuel does well, looked at that tape and decided the smart move was moving off his money entirely rather than running it back. When the team that understood his specific skill set better than anyone else in football decides it's time to move on, that's a signal worth taking seriously, not dismissing as just a cap-driven business decision. And here's the thing about last year in Washington that I think the highlight reel version of this conversation conveniently leaves out. Samuel only ended up as the Commanders' leading receiver by circumstance, not by outplaying a healthy competition. Terry McLaurin and most of that receiving corps were banged up for large stretches of the season, which opened the target share for Samuel to feast on volume even as his per-catch efficiency kept sliding. 72 catches sounds impressive in isolation, and 99 targets tells you he was genuinely featured in that offense. But when your counting stats are propped up by circumstance rather than explosiveness, that's exactly the kind of season that looks better in a highlight package than it does when you actually trace the tape play by play. Now let's talk about where this market has actually gone, because I think it's the most objective evidence available, more objective than any single stat line or any single game of tape. Multiple outlets floated the Miami Dolphins as an ideal fit for Samuel earlier this offseason, given their genuine hole at receiver after a draft class that addressed the position only with day 3 picks. That's about as clean a match as you could ask for on paper: real need, real opportunity for immediate playing time, a reasonable market size, and even that fit hasn't produced a signed contract. Teams have been connected to him in speculative pieces for months now. The Chiefs, a reunion angle with a familiar coaching voice out in Los Angeles, and none of it has actually materialized into ink on paper. When a name this recognizable, with a fit this seemingly obvious in at least one case, still can't find a taker deep into July, that tells you the league's collective evaluation of the risk here runs deeper than just a thin market for aging skill players in general. Teams are doing the same tape study I just walked you through, and they're clearly landing on similar conclusions about where his trajectory is actually headed. Samuel himself, to his credit, has been refreshingly honest and a little defiant about the whole situation. He put out a video on his own channel recently pushing back on the doubters, insisting he's still got 3 or 4 good years left in the tank as he heads into his 8th NFL season. I respect that competitiveness, and it's exactly the kind of attitude you'd want from a guy heading into a make-or-break contract year wherever he lands. But confidence and box score reality are two different things, and the box score, the market, and the game tape are all telling a pretty consistent story right now that doesn't quite match the self-assessment. Let's also address the "he can play in the slot now" argument directly, because I've seen that used as the main pitch for why he'd fit next to Chase and Higgins specifically. It's true that Debo at this stage of his career profiles more as a slot weapon than the outside X receiver role he played at his 2021 peak. But Cincinnati's actual slot situation isn't the glaring need people seem to think it is. This coaching staff has already shown real confidence in its younger receiving depth stepping into complementary roles, and, more importantly, Jamar Chase himself is comfortable and effective lining up in the slot when this offense wants to create specific matchups, which gives Cincinnati positional flexibility most teams simply don't have without adding an outside name at all. The slot isn't an empty need waiting to be filled, it's a role this offense already has multiple credible answers for, which only reinforces the larger point that this signing would be about star power, not about solving an actual football problem. So where does that leave things? Here's my honest, bottom-line take on both of these storylines heading into camp. On Joe Mixon, if the reporting holds up, and right now there's no real reason to doubt it, this is simply a sad, quiet ending to a genuinely good career that deserves real respect and real gratitude from this fan base, not a roster-building hypothetical. He gave this organization 7 years, including some of its darkest ones, and got to experience one of its most magical runs as a direct, load-bearing contributor. If this is really it, I hope he gets whatever moment of recognition this fan base wants to give him down the road, whether that's a Ring of Honor conversation someday or just a genuine, heartfelt goodbye whenever it becomes official. On Deebo Samuel, I understand the appeal of the name, I understand why it generates headlines and hot take videos, but when you actually run the numbers, the declining production, the cooling market, and most importantly, the complete lack of positional need on a roster that's already loaded at receiver, I don't think this is a move Cincinnati should be making, and frankly, I don't think it's a move they will make. This front office has been too disciplined, too need-driven all offseason to suddenly pivot into a splashy, unnecessary addition at the one position on this roster that never needed the help in the first place. And honestly, I think that discipline is exactly why this fan base should feel good heading into camp, regardless of how either of these two storylines plays out. A front office that's willing to pass on an exciting, splashy name because it doesn't actually address a real roster need is a front office that's thinking clearly about what it takes to build a genuine championship roster, not just what generates the most exciting offseason headlines. The flashy move isn't always the smart move, and I'd rather see this organization stay locked in on linebacker depth, cornerback depth, and getting its own core players extended than chase a name that, no matter how recognizable, doesn't move the needle on this team's actual path back to the postseason. One last thought before we wrap up, because I think it ties both of these storylines together in a way that's worth naming directly. Football fandom, and honestly sports media in general, has a real bias toward the exciting hypothetical over the boring correct answer. A Mixon reunion storyline generates more clicks than a respectful acknowledgement that a career is likely over. A Deebo Samuel pairing with Chase and Higgins generates more excitement than a sober breakdown of declining yards per catch and a cooling market. But being a good fan, and honestly being a good analyst, sometimes means resisting the pull of the fun story in favor of the accurate one. The accurate story here is that one former Bengals career appears to have quietly and unfairly ended, deserving of respect rather than roster speculation, and one connected name doesn't actually address anything this specific roster needs, deserving of a clear-eyed pass rather than breathless hype. Neither of those conclusions is as fun to talk about as the alternative version of either story. But I'd rather give you the honest read than the exciting one, every single time. All right, that's going to do it for this one. Two very different storylines, two very different verdicts, a respectful send-off for a genuinely good Bengals career that appears to be over, and a pass on a name that's generating more hype than substance heading into camp. If you disagree with me on either take, or if you think I'm sleeping on what Deebo Samuel could still bring to this offense, get in the comments and let me know, because I read every single one. And if you're not subscribed to Dre Talk Sports yet, hit that subscribe button, turn on your notifications, because we've got no-filter roster breakdowns, insider reports, and deep dive analysis coming all the way through camp and into the season. Bengals fans, training camp starts this week. Let's go.